You're listening to Podcast Rockstars, the show helping business leaders become podcast legends. Now, here's your host, Dawn Lidwell.
Welcome back to Podcast Rockstars, the show that helps business leaders become podcasting legends. I'm your host, Dawn Lidwell, the founder of Lidwell Writing Services, and my special guest today is our amazing client, Sigrun. Sigrun is the leading business mentor for female online entrepreneurs throughout Europe. She is a TEDx speaker and the host of The Sigrun Show. She started her online business in 2014, and within 4 years, she built a 7-figure business. Sigrun's motto is to be inspired, think big, and take action. And through her podcast, she has helped thousands of female entrepreneurs do exactly that. In August 2017, she launched her podcast, and by June 2018, she achieved the unthinkable, releasing 200 episodes and achieving 100,000 downloads. Sigrun joins me today to share how she launched her show with a whopping 100 episodes in 100 days. She shares how taking on such a massive feat helps her nurture her mailing list and the tools she uses to streamline her podcasting process. She also shares how her podcast has helped her grow her business and her bottom line. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Sigrun. Sigrun, thank you so much for being one of our first guests on the Podcast Rockstars show. I've already given our listeners a little taste of who you are, what you do, and the podcast that you produce, but can you tell us a little more about yourself, your business, and your show, and what made you decide to start a podcast?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and share how I came to actually starting a podcast. I started my business just over 5 years ago, and podcasting wasn't really in, I think, then. And since I wasn't really a podcast listener myself, it was not on my radar. And I started writing blog posts, and that was very tiring. I found it very hard to sit down and write blog posts. And I started weekly webinars, middle of 2014. And that was really fun. I found my groove there, and it was so much fun. And I built my list. And I'm a business coach. Actually, I'm more of a business mentor. I don't ask people back what they should do. I tell them what to do, how to do it, when to do it. And I was building up my list with weekly webinars, and that worked really well. But, you know, Facebook ad cost has gone up, and always kind of getting people to show up live to the webinars was getting harder. I had like a 30-40% attendance rate in the beginning, and it went down. And you kind of have to do lots of reminders, and it was just not a good list building tool for me anymore. It's great for launching, but not for list building. So I started to think probably back in 2016, after 2 years in business, about a podcast. And I was like, well, a lot of people are doing podcasts. It must be something that's good to do. And I asked my coach at the time what she thought about it. And she was very negative about it. She said, well, you know, all these interviews with other people, you are just building their businesses and not yours. And I'm like, oh, maybe she's right. But I don't want to blame it on her. I think it was more like I was curious. I was asking a lot of questions. I was trying to figure out if this was something for me. I was still doing my webinars, not weekly anymore, but quite regularly. But I was getting tired. I was getting very tired of doing them. I did over 100, probably 110 or 20 before I said, hey, enough is enough. I'm only going to do it when I launch and not just for list building sake. And I thought to myself, I have to do something. And for a while, actually, I didn't do anything in terms of content marketing. I would launch. I had built my business by doing first one-on-one coaching. Then I moved over to groups in 2015. And in 2016, I continued the groups. They completely replaced my one-on-one income. And then 2017 came along, and I thought, I really need to do some content marketing. I don't want to do the webinars anymore. I don't have the patience for blogging. I find it really hard to sit down. I had been doing like a little bit Facebook Live was starting, but I was like, there must be something else. And that idea of a podcast came up very strongly. I was not working with the other coach. I was working with a new coach now, and he had a podcast, so that influenced me a bit. And then I attended Social Media Marketing World in San Diego, 2017. And I attended a track on podcasting. And I listened to everybody, John Lee Dumas, Pat Flynn, all these famous podcasters in the online marketing space. And I was like still thinking, don't know if it's for me. I think it's difficult. And these people have been in business very long. And then the last talk of the day was Kate, that is the partner of John Lee Dumas. And she had a very simple talk. She looked very nervous, which made her more likable. And she had slides. She had a picture of her laptop and a simple $80 microphone. And she said she was so nervous starting her podcast, but she thought she should do one since she was running a company that makes a living of helping people do a podcast. She felt she needed her own. And she started reading her blog posts. And when I heard that, I was like, boom, I can do that. So I had about 30 blog posts, but I had over 100 webinars. And I had slides with many of them. And I thought, that's how I can get started. And even though I didn't really do that, I did read some of my blog posts, but it really just made the whole thing sound more easy. And so I decided that I think it's probably end of March that I was going to do it. I made the decision then and there, listening to her, that I was going to do it. And at the same conference, there was Mark Schaefer speaking about his recently released book, Known, How to Get Known. And he brought examples of people that had done something a little bit more extreme. He talked about a guy who did 200 YouTube videos in 200 days and was able to build up his business. And I was like, boom, that's another idea. I should do 100 episodes in 100 days when I launch my podcast. So on the plane back from San Diego to Zurich, Switzerland, I brainstormed on 100 topics for my podcast. And so that's basically how I got the idea for a podcast, how I decided. But it took me until it was 2nd of August that I actually released the first episode. So it took me a while to actually get everything together and get started.
So how would you say that launching 100 episodes in 100 days because it sounds like you were using it basically to build your list, to increase your authority. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think the idea was like how to become known. Was the idea behind the 100 episodes. And I, wanted to use for list building, but even before I launched, I think I got more clarity that it's kind of hard to find a podcast, It's kind of, you have to jump through some hoops and go to iTunes or Spotify, and you have to know the name of the podcast, and it's not as easy as promoting a video on Facebook or a blog post. So I'm not sure I had so much clarity. I just knew that I needed to find a way to do content marketing. And it was not going to be a blog, and I was tired of the webinars. So it seemed like the only option was podcasting, and it has felt like it was more people knew how to actually download the app and listen. But what actually happened, I would say, I launched 2nd of August. Very strategically, actually, because a month later, I was going into a marketing campaign of my signature program. So I had created a signature program. It's called SOMBA, Sigruns Online MBA, 12-month program to start, build, and scale an online business. And I had created it in January. I had launched it once in June. And I thought to myself, I need to time the launch of the podcast so that it actually benefits my marketing campaign. So a month before I was going to sell the program, I launched the podcast, and I really think it helped a lot because people who were maybe on my list or found out about me through the launch, they had something to go to. We used it in the emails when people signed up for instance, a webinar. In the welcome email, there would be links to 3 podcast episodes. So they immediately kind of had me in their ears listening to me. So that was a big benefit. What I figured out by having now a podcast for over a year, almost 1.5 years now, is it's not so huge for list building, honestly. It's kind of like easier for me to do Facebook ads, get them to sign up for something, and then tell them about the podcast, and then they're eager to listen. It's still very much word of mouth, and being a podcast guest, that helps a lot. because a person that listens to one podcast is very likely to listen to another.
You're basically using it more to nurture your list rather than build it.
Yeah, and that really works because I wasn't really, I had my newsletter obviously before, but you need to nurture people. It typically takes people maybe 3 months until they buy a product. Or one of my friends has calculated that it takes 13 months until people buy her main product. So she has a podcast also for the same reason. Like, she needs to have multiple ways to nurture people on this path so that they know her, they trust her, they like what she's doing before they're ready to buy.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. Okay, other than just the webinars, did you have any other strategies that you used to kind of come up with 100 episode ideas? Because I mean, personally, I'm struggling with 20.
Yeah, I had the 100 webinars, which helped a lot, but I also had people that I wanted to interview. So I made my wish list, so to speak, of people that I wanted to interview. Obviously, I wanted to interview Kate with the idea of, she had inspired me with the podcast, Mark, because of the book Known. So they were my two first guests. And when I told them why I wanted to interview them, they were so eager to say yes, which is wonderful. And then I had many others that I had gotten to know over the past years. I had been in business already for a while. I think that's helpful. To do a podcast when you have built a network already before, because I could reach out easily to 50 people and I had my interview guests. So I made it a mix. Another thing that I also did, I did on-air coaching. So I had this mix of solo episodes, guest speakers, and on-air coaching. So that's easy to fill up than 100 episodes.
And I have to say that I absolutely like the on-air coaching ones. I personally learn a lot from them. When you were first launching, what would you say was the biggest challenge? Because it sounds like you already had a lot of ideas for content. Was there any maybe technical challenges, or what kind of challenges did you face and how did you overcome them?
The first thing was to get everything together. I think the first episode I probably recorded 3-4 times. It's hard to get started and figuring out my process. The technology, I just asked around and I was recommended good microphone, and I'm quite tech savvy, so I didn't find that an issue. I decided from the start, though, to hire a podcast editor. So already in March, I reached out and found a podcast editor and kind of had a timeline in mind and told her this crazy idea of doing 100 episodes in 100 days, which she thought was quite exciting to be a part of. And so then it just took me time basically to get started. It was easy to procrastinate on a project like this. You are the boss, or I'm the boss in this case. And there was nobody telling me, oh, you have to launch at this date. But I realized as we get into the spring and summer, I'm like, I have to set the date and I have to start to publicly announce it. And that's what I started to do. And this forced me to start to record the solo episodes, to book in the guests and get it all going. And once I started booking guests, I realized how I could automate things. So my process is fully automated. People do not receive an email from me, for instance. It's all automated from my systems. And setting this all up required some time, but I think it was more just sitting out and getting started was the most difficult part.
Would you say that had anything to do with mindset? Maybe you were nervous?
Yeah, I was I procrastinate on certain things, until I'm okay, I'm not gonna procrastinate any further. Well, maybe not nervous, but wanting to make it perfect. I think it's perfectionism. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I can relate to that. You were talking about some systems and strategies in automation. What type of tools do you use?
Yes. So when typically I reach out to my guests myself so far. And then I maybe write them a private message or an email, typically private message, because I know most of my guests. And if they agree to come on the show, I give them a link to schedule, and I use a tool called Schedule Once. And in the tool Schedule Once, I've created a podcasting link that is different from my other links. And it has, you can upload a file, like a profile picture. You can put in links to your CV or paste your biography. And I have instructions how to do all of that. So once they have filled out the form and booked their time, there's no further communication needed on my behalf. Like they get automatically an email where I say, this will be on Zoom. This is a video and audio podcast. And I don't need to do anything, and then automatically mine just come from Schedule Once. And I find that very good to have this so automated, because I just need to see that the guest has booked, and then the rest is taken care of. What I noticed is like, okay, the information was then in Schedule Once. So then I needed to make sure that for our show notes and for our blog posts that go with every episode, that all the information is easily available for my team. So I used Zapier to take the information from Schedule Once into a Google Doc. So for every guest I have on my show, automatically created a Google Doc, which has the link to the profile picture and the bio and any other links that are needed. And that's how I've been able to kind of automate this process and make it super easy.
Wow. See, I don't use Schedule Once. I use Acuity, actually. But our system is very similar.
Yeah, I think you can use it with any system. Zapier is a tool that connects with over 1,000 apps. It's just having this idea of like, how can you make it so easy for you and your team to look for information when you need them? So when I'm writing my episode notes, so basically if I interview a guest, I'll just come on a call. Typically I know them, so I don't need a lot of preparation. But if I have an interview coming up in April with Mark Schaefer actually again, and he has a new book released, of course I will make sure I read the book before I interview him. Mm-hmm. But in most cases, there's not much preparation needed, because I'm curious about the person. That's why I invited them. So I will just have already questions in my head. So I'll come on the call and record, but afterwards I have to record the intro. And that's where it's so easy. I go into my Google Drive. I find that one document that had the biography of the person, and I write it in 5 minutes or so, and then it takes me a minute to record the intro.
But yeah, that sounds like a really good way to keep everything automated and systematized.
Yeah. And then I have a huge Excel sheet. And I didn't see this anywhere. I basically was thinking, how can I know when what is done? And how can I also keep track of all my different episodes? Because I want to make sure that I'm not repeating, for instance, titles again or something like that. So a lot of people use Asana for their podcast. And I thought, well, in Asana, you just tick off a task and you don't have the full overview of what you've done already. So that didn't work for me. So instead, I use a Google Sheet, and it has, 20, 30 columns. And it has the episode number. It has the date when the episode should be released. It has the title. It has the guest, if there's a guest. It has, when I'm going to record it. Has the recording been done? Is the intro, when I'm going to record the intro, because I like to batch the intro recordings if I can. And then whether the show has been edited, has the intro and the show been merged together? What is the link to the Libsyn hosting service? We also have our SEO keywords. And then we have a clip, like a 30-second clip from each episode, so we can create little videos on Wave and release them on Instagram. So this is all in the sheet. So this is kind of our project management tool. It's just a Google Sheet. And every time I show this, people are like blown away. They've never seen anything like this. And I thought, this is just a sheet. But I guess having the idea to actually put it together like this, so I've started to give it to my clients, not with the content, but like, I show them how it looks like, and then I give them an empty sheet to fill out.
Oh, well, I can honestly say that seeing your sheet, and your Google Drive sheet is definitely extensive. It has everything there. So it's very detailed and organized. How would you say that launching 100 episodes in 100 days has impacted your business? Because if I recall correctly, I believe you reached 100,000 downloads within your first year.
Yes, I did. And actually, we are probably at 180,000 now.
Okay, you've got to give us some details on how you did that.
Well, it does help to have multiple episodes. So if you have a small audience listening and they have more to listen to, you're going to have more downloads. So that's just basic math. And I think that's what I counted on. I knew I didn't have my list is not huge. My business is growing and it's $1 million business, but I don't have a huge email list or a huge social media following. And I thought to myself, okay, how do I have that massive impact? And with 100 episodes in 100 days, there were people that really listened to every episode. So you need less listeners to have more downloads because I just have more episodes. And then I moved over to 3 episodes a week. And that still is growing. And there was a little dip when I switched, of course. And now we're going to have probably a little dip as well when we move over to 1 episode a week.
Do you think having a podcast has directly impacted the growth of your business?
Yes. It's difficult to measure. And I wouldn't say that somebody should just run and create a podcast and you are going to be a millionaire. That's not how it works. What really helped me is that I had an audience, I had the products, and I added podcasts to my content marketing. And that allowed me to nurture my audience much better than without. And even in our help desk or even in my paid programs, I often refer to my podcast. If somebody has a question, I'm like, oh, I've covered this in my podcast. So the podcast is a great way for me because my brain is full of knowledge on online business, online marketing, just building a business in general. I did turnarounds and mergers before as a CEO. So it's full of content, and there's no way I can communicate all of this in my programs. So also the podcast is a way for me to just, get my ideas out there and communicate them. And so yes, it has directly impacted my bottom line, but you cannot say, oh, it was this episode or, you have to have 100 episodes, 100 days. I think it's just more of a gut feeling that I know that without the podcast, I would not be where I am today.
Good point. Good point. So if you could give one piece of advice or tip or strategy to a new or aspiring podcaster, what would it be? Or what would you tell Sigrun over a year ago before you launched?
Well, tell myself. Let me imagine someone else. So first of all, I don't think a total beginner in business should do a podcast. I think it's much easier to launch a podcast if you have an audience. It doesn't need to be big, but have an audience before you start. And then get help. And that's what I am so happy I did. I got a podcast editor, show note writer. I have my assistant doing the blog posts. Now I have someone doing my Insta stories to send over to my podcast. Basically, when I have recorded a podcast episode, my job is done. And I was smart enough to do this right from the start. And I recommend when you're building a business, this is not your zone of genius to do all these tasks. You need to hire professionals and let them do their job. And you do what you're best at and leave the rest to someone else.
Good advice. Sigrun, thank you so much for your wisdom and tips and all of the information you have shared with us today. Where can my listeners go to learn more about you, your programs, and obviously your show?
Yes, let's start with the podcast. So I have the Sigrun Show. You're going to find that on iTunes and Spotify and all the regular places. I actually also have a second podcast, which is more of a daily inspiration. It's 90 seconds per day. That's also on Alexa and Google Home and Apple Home. Plus, it's also a podcast that you can get on iTunes and Spotify and all these regular places. And then my website is sigrun.com. And you're going to find me also on social media with the handle sigrun.com everywhere.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and my audience today and share your tips and your advice. You are a true inspiration, Sigrun.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Podcast Rockstars, sponsored by Lidwell Writing Services, because a great podcast deserves great show notes. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes and leave us a review, and remember to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Join our exclusive Podcast Rockstars Facebook community to connect with other podcasting legends. In the Facebook community, you can ask your most pressing questions and tell us who you would love to hear on the show. And if you're ready to experience the power of great show notes, contact Dawn at lidwellwriting.com.